Hello, students, and welcome to our third lesson of Unit 3. This lesson is going to be on conscience, and you can find the relevant materials for this in the textbook on page 141 through 146. And there's also a supplemental article I will give you to read. It's also posted on PowerSchool. It's called Homework 2, and it's an article from St. Mary's Press. It's going to be on a pink sheet, which I'll show you in this lecture, and then I will talk a little bit more about that. So please take notes, and let's get started. So our learning objectives for this lesson are to summarize possible scientific evidence for the reality of conscience, define conscience and explain how it works, cite popular misconceptions about conscience and explain why they're wrong, explain the relationship between conscience and the natural moral law, and for our final product, the assignment is going to be called Classwork 11. It's going to be your assessment that you'll do in class with your teams. You'll create a final product that'll show the 3 dimensions of conscience working in action by analyzing examples. And like I said, it's going to be called Classwork 11, and we'll go over that at the end of the lesson. Okay, to begin with, we watched a film. It's or a television clip. It's from 60 Minutes, and it's on the Baby Lab at Yale. Now, I know some of you watched this junior year in Mr. Norman's class because he was using it to make a point about human development. I'm showing it because it's going to give us some scientific evidence for the existence of conscience in synderasis. So we watched this in class. If you are absent, I'm going to play it in this presentation now. There's also a link on PowerSchool, or you could just Google it on YouTube, Yale Baby Lab. We're going to be watching this 60-minute piece and then talking a little bit about why it's important and its implications for ethics. Okay, and here is the Yale Baby Lab video.
It's a question people have asked for as long as there have been people. Are human beings inherently good? Are we born with a sense of morality? Or do we arrive blank slates waiting for the world to teach us right from wrong? Or could it be worse? Do we start out nasty, selfish devils who need our parents, teachers, and religions to whip us into shape? The only way to know for sure, of course, is to ask a baby. But until recently, it's been hard to persuade them to open up and share their secrets. Enter the Baby Lab.
The story will continue in a moment.
This is the creature at the center of the greatest philosophical, moral, and religious debates about the nature of man, the human baby. They don't do much, can't talk, can't write, can't expound at length about their moral philosophies. But does that mean they don't have one? The philosopher Rousseau considered babies perfect idiots knowing nothing. And Yale psychologist Karen Wynn, director of the Infant Cognition Center here, the Baby Lab, says from most of its history, her field agreed.
Didn't we just think that these creatures at 3 months and even 6 months were basically just little blobs?
Oh, sure. I mean, if you look at them, they kind of look like little, cute little blobs, but they can't do all the things that an older child can. They can't even do the things that a dog or a pigeon or a rat can.
No pulling levers for treats or running mazes for these study subjects, but they can watch puppet shows.
Up goes the curtain.
And Wynn is part of a new wave of researchers who have discovered seemingly simple ways to probe what's really going on in those adorable little heads.
Up goes the curtain.
We watched as Wynn and her team asked a question that 20 years ago might have gotten her laughed out of her field. Does Wesley here, at the ripe old age of 5 months, know the difference between right and wrong? Wesley watches as the puppet in the center struggles to open up a box with a toy inside. The puppy in the yellow shirt comes over and lends a hand. Then the scene repeats itself, but this time the puppy in the blue shirt comes and slams the box shut. Nice behavior? Mean behavior. At least to our eyes. But is that how a 5-month-old sees it? And does he have a preference?
Wesley, do you remember these guys from the show?
To find out, a researcher who doesn't know which puppet was nice and which was mean offers Wesley a choice.
Who do you like?
He can't answer, but he can reach.
That one.
Wesley chose the good guy, and he wasn't alone.
That one.
More than 3/4 of the babies tested reached for the nice puppet.
That one.
Wynn tried it out on even younger babies, 3-month-olds, who can't control their arms enough to reach. But they can vote with their eyes, since research has shown that even very young babies look longer at things they like.
Which one do you like?
Daisy here looked at the mean puppet for 5 seconds, then switched to the nice one for 33.
Babies, even at 3 months, looked towards the nice character and looked hardly at all, much shorter times, towards the unhelpful character.
So basically, as young as 3 months old, we human beings show a preference for nice people over mean people.
Study after study after study, the results are always consistently babies feeling positively towards helpful individuals in the world and disapproving, disliking, maybe condemning individuals who are antisocial towards others.
It's astonishing.
Wynn and her team first published their findings about baby morality in the journal Nature in 2007. And they've continued to publish follow-up studies in other peer-reviewed journals ever since. For instance, on this experiment, they showed babies like James here a puppet behaving badly. Instead of rolling the ball back to the puppet in the middle, this green-shirted bunny keeps the other puppet's ball and runs away. Then James is shown a second show. This time, the bunny, who we just saw steal the ball, tries to open up the box to get the toy. Will James still prefer the puppet who helps out, or will he now prefer the one who slams the box shut?
Who do you like?
He chose the one who slammed it shut, as did 81% of babies tested. The study's conclusion, babies seem to view the ball thief as deserving punishment.
So do you think that babies, therefore, are born with an innate sense of justice?
At a very elemental level, I think so.
We think we see here the foundations for morality.
Some way to do the punishment.
Paul Bloom is also a professor of psychology at Yale with his own lab. He's collaborated with Wynn on many of her baby studies, and he also happens to be her husband.
I feel we're making discoveries. I feel like we're discovering that what seems to be one way really isn't. What seems to be an ignorant and unknowing baby is actually a creature with this alarming sophistication, subtle knowledge.
And he says discovering this in babies who can't walk, talk, or even crawl yet suggests it has to come built in.
So remember B.F. Skinner, who said that we had to teach our children everything through conditioning. So does this just wipe him off the map?
What we're finding in the baby lab is that there's more to it than that there's a universal moral core that all humans share. The seeds of our understanding of justice, our understanding of right and wrong, are part of our biological nature.
Wait a minute. If babies are born with a basic sense of right and wrong, a universal moral core, where does all the evil in the world come from? Is that all learned? Well, maybe not. Take a look at this new series of discoveries in the Yale Baby Lab.
Would you like a snack?
In offering babies the seemingly small, innocuous choice, graham crackers or Cheerios, Wynn is probing something big, the origins of bias, the tendency to prefer others who are similar to ourselves.
adults will like others who share even really absolutely trivial similarities with them.
So will Nate, who chose Cheerios over graham crackers,
Hi.
prefer this orange cat, who also likes Cheerios, over this gray cat who likes graham crackers instead?
Which one do you like?
Apparently so.
Remember these guys?
But if babies have positive feelings for the similar puppet, do they actually have negative feelings for the one who's different? To find out, Wynn showed babies the gray cat, the one who liked the opposite food, struggling to open up the box to get a toy. Will Gregory want to see the graham cracker eater treated well? Or does he want him treated badly?
Which one do you like? That one. Okay.
Gregory seemed to want the different puppet treated badly.
That is amazing. So he went with his bias in a way.
And so did Nate,
That one.
and 87% of the other babies tested. From this, Wynn concludes that infants prefer those who harm others who are unlike them.
What could be more arbitrary than whether you like graham crackers or Cheerios?
Nothing.
Nothing. But it matters. It matters to the young baby. We are predisposed to break the world up into different human groups based on the most subtle and seemingly irrelevant cues. And that, to some extent, is the dark side of morality.
We want the other to be punished.
In our studies, babies seem as if they do want the other to be punished.
We used to think that we were taught to hate. I think there was a song like that. This is suggesting that we're not taught to hate. We're born to hate.
I think that we are built at the, to at the drop of a hat create us and them.
And that's why we're not that moral. We have an initial moral sense that is in some ways very impressive, and in some ways really depressing. That we see some of the worst biases in adults reflected in the minds and in the behaviors of young babies.
But Bloom says understanding our earliest instincts can help.
If you want to eradicate racism, for instance, you really are going to want to know to what extent are babies little bigots? To what extent is racism a natural part of humanity?
Sounds to me like the experiments show they are little bigots.
I think to some extent a bias to favor the self, where the self could be people who look like me, people who act like me, people with the same taste as me, is a very strong human bias. It is what one would expect from a creature like us who evolved through natural selection, but it has terrible consequences.
He says it makes sense that evolution would predispose us to be wary of the other for survival. And so we need society and parental nurturing to intervene. He showed us one last series of experiments being done in his lab, not with babies, but with older children of different ages.
Blue.
The kids get to decide how many tokens they'll get versus how many will go to another child they're told will come in later.
I love coins.
They're told the tokens can be traded in for prizes.
So you can say green, and if you say green, then you get this one, and the other girl doesn't get any. Or you can say blue, and if you say blue, then you get these two, and the other girl gets these two. So, green.
Green.
The youngest kids in the study will routinely choose to get fewer prizes for themselves
Green.
just to get more than the other kid.
I'll pick green.
In some cases, a lot more.
The youngest children in these studies are obsessed with social comparison.
So you get 7, she doesn't get any.
Yay!
They don't care about fairness. What they want is they want relatively more.
But a funny thing happens as kids get older.
Green.
Around 8, they start choosing the equal fair option more and more.
Green.
And by 9 or 10, we saw kids doing something really crazy,
Green.
deliberately giving the other kid more.
Green or blue?
Green.
They become generous.
See?
Chalk one up to society.
They've already been educated.
They've been educated, they've been enculturated, they have their heads stuffed full of the virtues that we might want to have their heads stuffed with. culture and education.
So we can learn to temper some of those nasty tendencies we're wired for, the selfishness, the bias. But he says the instinct is still there.
When we have these findings with the kids who choose this and not this,
Who do you like?
the kids in the baby studies who favor the one who's similar to them, the same taste and everything, none of this goes away. I think as adults, we could only see these and kind of nod.
Yeah, it's still in us. We're fighting it.
And the truth is, when we're under pressure, when life is difficult, we regress to our younger selves, and all of this elaborate stuff we have on top disappears.
But of course, adversity can bring out the best in us, too. Heroism, selfless sacrifice for strangers, all of which may have its roots right here.
Great kindness, great altruism, a magnificent sense of impartial justice have their seeds in the baby's mind. Both aspects of us, the good and the bad, are the product, I think, of biological evolution.
So it seems we're left where we all began, with a mix of altruism, selfishness, justice, bigotry. Kindness. A lot more than any of us expected to discover in a blob.
Well, I end my conversation with you with far more respect for babies. Who knew?
Okay. Okay. So, some of the comments from the journalist weren't really the best interpretations. The question is, we did this in Pear Deck in class, what conclusions can you draw from the video? So the reason why I showed it is this, we all experience conscience. We all experience a sense of right and wrong, and we have an ability to judge. And that ability to judge and give value, ability to value. So the babies preferred the one that liked the snacks they like, or they preferred the nice animal over the mean animal. That's called synderesis. Synderesis is just the human capacity to perceive value. What conscience does is it uses that primal sense of synderesis, do good, avoid evil, and applies it to specific situations. And so what we're seeing in the video is this basic capacity that we've all experienced. And throughout history, we've all experienced the pangs of our conscience. But this study is interesting because it gives us some scientific evidence that synderesis does exist. And so from the perspective of ethics, we're actually seeing science finally kind of proving something that we've always known experientially, and that religions and ethical systems have been trying to understand since the time of Aristotle. So it's very interesting that this video gives us some scientific insight into the biological and evolutionary existence of a capacity to value in humans. So that's why I showed it, and I thought it was really interesting. So let's continue to the next part of the lesson. Okay, so this next part is a part of the lesson that doesn't come from the book. It's something I'm using to supplement from a book I used previously. Before we say what the conscience is, we want to say what it is not, because it's the conscience is our ability to use reason to judge specific situations, but because it's an abstract concept, it's sometimes very difficult to define and understand. So first of all, it's not the majority of opinion. So the problem with this is conscience judges objective facts. It's not, it doesn't go with the whims of popular opinion, because that would surrender ultimately. Personal responsibility would be surrendered to the latest group or survey. So the conscience isn't merely a barometer of popular opinion. Next, it's not merely a feeling. Now, I know subjectively we experience it sometimes as a feeling, so your conscience is speaking with you when you feel guilt. So even though you may experience it as a feeling or an emotion, we need to always remember conscience is a faculty of reason. Basically, conscience is not really a thing. It's more something we do. It's when we apply reason to a specific SPECIFIC, a specific situation. So we don't want to devolve into moral relativity, because if it's only a feeling, then it becomes utterly subjective. But again, the whole point of the conscience is to help us orient ourselves toward objective truths that we can know through the natural moral law and divine revelation. It's also not the superego. This would be a negative view of conscience that we get from Freud, and he would argue that the conscience is just feelings that you've kind of conditioned yourself to feel because of an outside authority figure like a father. But this denies awareness of God's plan. It's not just merely the superego imposing, ideas on you from without. And it's not something that comes necessarily as forced punch from the outside. Rather, it's a deep sense of awareness of God's plan, and it's our reasoning ability to know God's plan, know how to fit into it, and then we have to use the will to either act in accord with God's plan or not. Now, let me go to the next one. Okay, so continuing on about what the conscience is not. It's not merely a gut instinct. Now, again, sometimes we experience it as a gut instinct, but we don't want to equate it with gut instinct completely, because that would kind of dismiss the role reason plays. The conscience comes from your intellect, not from your gut. So again, when I think about the way I experience my conscience, sometimes subjectively it feels like it's my gut, but actually it's really your mind. If you're not using reason, if you're not using your intellect, then you're using not your conscience, but more your appetites and desires. So anytime you're using conscience, the evidence of at least good use of conscience is that you're engaging reason in your mind. Jiminy Cricket, sometimes we personify conscience as either like a Jiminy Cricket character or an angel and a devil kind of on your shoulders telling you what to do. And those personifications are helpful because it takes something abstract and gives us a way to understand it better. But the reason why they're problematic is we don't want to think of the conscience as something separate from the self. Rather, the conscience is at the core of who we are. It's where we're alone with God. So your conscience becomes very definitive of who you are as a person. It's not something that's external to the self. And finally, some would say it's just a myth. Especially if you're, say, a materialist. A materialist is someone that believes ultimately that nothing exists that's not material. So they would say that the conscience is merely a myth, or it's a hallucination. But the problem with that is nobody lives that way. It would lead to the death of morality. If there's no such thing as a conscience, then no one's going to be held responsible for their actions. And we just in practice, Aristotle would do a practical refutation of that idea. In practice, it would be impossible to live in society if we didn't have a faculty of the intellect that could help us to figure out what is right and wrong. So we've talked about what the conscience is not. Now let's take a look at what the conscience is. So this is a definition of conscience from the Catechism. Conscience is a judgment of reason whereby the human person recognizes the moral quality of a concrete act that he is going to perform, is in the process of performing, or has already completed. So you'll see that the conscience, again, the seat of conscience is the intellect. It's a faculty of reason, and so it makes judgments. Now, in our culture today, the term judgment has a kind of a bad connotation. People are always saying, you can't judge me, or who are you to judge? Well, we all make judgments all the time. Even the statement that you can't judge me is a judgment that judging is wrong. So it's incoherent to say that judging is bad because that's a judgment. But in any case, conscience is our intellectual ability to apply reason to specific concrete acts. Just the idea that things have moral quality, that's a more basic sense called synderesis. And again, the conscience ideally should be working before we perform an action, while we're doing it, and then reflecting afterward. And we ask ourselves, well, sometimes if we're under pressure, we don't use reason so well, and so we look back and ask ourselves, was that really the right thing to do? And this was the quote I was talking about earlier. In all he says and done, man is obliged to follow faithfully what he knows to be just and right, so we should always follow our conscience. It is by the judgment of his conscience that a man perceives and recognizes the prescriptions of the divine law. So this is how we can even understand and recognize both the divine law and also the natural moral law that we already talked about in the last lesson. And again, this is just a really nice quote from the Catechism that, if I recall correctly, I think they're quoting Blessed Fulton Sheen in this quote. And it is, conscience is the law of the mind. Conscience is the messenger of him who both in nature and in grace speaks to us behind a veil and teaches and rules us by his representatives. Conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ. And so what they mean by that there is that conscience is that quiet place. A vicar is a representative. Aboriginal means original or the first. So conscience is the first representative of Christ in the human heart, where he speaks to us behind a veil. So what they mean by that is we can't see it, but we've all experienced the experience of conscience. We know it's there. So conscience is that place where we're kind of alone with God in our heart, and nobody else may know what we think or why we act, but our conscience does. So it's very much related to the part of the moral object that relates to your intentions and motives for actions. Okay, this is just a quick frequently asked questions on conscience that I think you'll find helpful. The first question is, must I always follow my conscience? The teaching of the church is yes. You must always follow your conscience. You should never violate your conscience. Now, that raises a second question. Can my conscience ever be wrong? And the answer to that, again, is yes. Even a well-formed conscience can be wrong. Now, if, for example, you follow your conscience and find out later that you had made a mistake, remember your conscience should be working before, during, and after an action, then you're not guilty of a sin. Because remember, for a sin to be mortal, you have to have full knowledge and full consent of the will. So sometimes we might make a decision and not realize, or be under pressure and not maybe know what's the right thing to do. That's why we should always look back on our actions and reflect. And we have to inform the conscience. And informing the conscience basically just means teaching it about what is truly right and wrong. So, and then finally, what factors would lead to an erroneous conscience? Ignorance. So, like we said there, maybe you just didn't know. For example, that an example I've used before that was listening to a radio show where someone called in and said that they didn't know, they were Catholic, but they didn't know the church taught that using birth control is considered a grave moral evil in marriage. And so the woman's conscience was ignorant. She didn't know. Insincerity, I actually have this twice here. Insincerity of vice or rationalizations. So saying this is just the way I am. When people say that, it shows a form of insincerity that we remember vices or bad habits. None of us, we were all created in the image of God. Now, of course, we are fallen and we suffer from concupiscence, but none of us is naturally bad. So, for example, you know, a person who starts partying a lot might just eventually excuse their bad behavior, and they know it's wrong, but they'll say, well, this is just who I am. I can't change. Well, that's not true. The whole point of conscience is that conscience is it works with free will. And, even if you have vice, you may not feel like you have the strength of will to change, but we always got to remember we aren't like animals. We're not slave to instinct. We always can change. Bad examples. So if you grew up in a home where perhaps, a relative was, doing something that was bad, you might have learned from bad examples, and that might contribute to ignorance. False autonomy of the conscience is just the idea that, you're making your conscience like the law, like, well, no one can tell me what to do. Rejection of church teaching. So if you basically put your own opinion above the church, remember, Jesus gave the church his authority to teach through the magisterium. And to just say to yourself, well, the church is wrong, or I don't believe the church, to say that is going to lead to an erroneous conscience. Jesus didn't come and hand us a book. He came and gave us a church so that we could be guided by him continually through the Holy Spirit. Lack of true repentance, and that would be if, for example, like you kept doing the same action over and over again, like you were constantly lying, and you didn't ever really intend to change. That can lead to erroneous conscience. And finally, just lack of love. Lack of love, lack of consideration for the golden rule. And remember, love, as Bishop Barron says, is to will the good of the other. When we become selfish and we only think about what I want, what I need, that demonstrates that's going to lead you to a conscience that has a lack of love. It's self-centered rather than looking outward and other-centered. So those are some frequently asked questions on conscience. Now, let's take a look at the next slide. Okay, in the last slide, we'd mentioned conscience formation. Conscience formation is basically, conscience is like a lens through which you're looking at the world. And it's engaged. So if your brain is in here, there's your brain applying reason to specific situations. So should I cheat? Conscience engages reason and helps us make a good decision. But the conscience needs information in order to make a good decision. So you need to have some information to give your conscience so that it can use reason to apply that information to what you're doing. So we have to inform or form the conscience. So 3 sources of information for the conscience, at least from the Christian perspective, would be the natural law, which we talked about in the last lesson. It's the law written on the heart of mankind that we can know independently of religion. It's self-evident. such as the idea of freedom. We're going to look at a movie that's going to follow the Cristeros in Mexico and their fight for religious freedom. Nobody has to tell us we have religious freedom. That's inherent in what it means to be a person. There's the revealed law. This is the Old and New Testament, as well as the oral law promulgated by the church through her magisterium. So because of the fall, our ability to judge right and wrong has been a little bit tampered with. So synderesis should order us toward the good. Do good, avoid evil. So good, evil. But because of the fall, we have concupiscence. And that's the concupiscence. I think I spelled that wrong, but concupiscence is just that natural human inclination towards sin. So God gave us the revealed law to help us, again, better apply reason. So we can, there are certain things that, because of concupiscence, we would be drawn to, but God clearly elucidates for us that no, that is wrong. And then there's the civil law, or it's also called positive law. In the Christian tradition, and this would just be all the laws that come from our government. So, pay your taxes, you have to go to school, things like that. And again, here's that definition of conscience that we already talked about. So the last thing I'm going to go over is the homework assignment, which was a reading that gives a really good explanation of how synderesis, conscience, and the natural law work together. Okay, I'm not sure if this is starting at the right place, but the article we read was from St. Mary's Press. There's a link on PowerSchool. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly because I'm running out of battery, but it was a really good, short reading that had these questions with it. So if you're absent, you need to make this up, but it was a good analysis of conscience. So our first question there is, what is the relationship between reason, conscience, and the natural law? So the natural law is our participation, and I'm going to just put notes here for you, but you need to write in complete sentences. It's our participation in God's eternal law through the use of reason. And the way conscience comes into play is that conscience applies the specific, it applies the general principle, do good, avoid evil. That's the first principle. Is do good, avoid evil. That's a very vague statement, right? So conscience engages reason and helps us to apply this to specific situations. So the idea of do good, avoid evil, what would that look like in a situation where I'm on, say, Twitter and people are tweeting mean tweets? Conscience says, okay, I shouldn't tweet mean tweets. Or if your conscience is flawed, somebody tweeted a mean tweet about me, I'm going to do it right back at them. So, that's how your conscience would work. What is synderesis and how does it work? Why does it need to be formed? And this one was kind of an interesting question. Synderesis is sometimes equated with the conscience, but they're slightly different. Synderesis is the basic capacity of human beings. I'm trying to write neatly, but it's hard on this Chromebook. Basic capacity of human beings to understand value and universal moral principles. So universal moral principles, that would be the natural law. And so human beings have an ability to do this that makes us unique. Unlike animals. Animals don't, a lion doesn't feel guilty when it eats a zebra, right? There's no value judgment there. It's just nature. So it allows us to perceive the good, but the thing is, it needs to be formed. So it perceives the good, but it doesn't know what is truly good. So, for example, if you were a football player, being a better football player would be a good for you. That's what synderesis orders you toward. However, the problem with synderesis is, what if you had a coach that was pressuring you to use steroids? Well, the steroids might make you a better player. That's a good thing. So you use the steroids. That's why we need conscience, and it needs to be well formed. Conscience would be informed by reason, and hopefully by science, by education, by the moral law. And it would say, yeah, being a football player may be a good, but using steroids to do that wouldn't be a good thing. That's not really good. And so that's why conscience formation is so important. What is moral science? Why is it important? That's what they call conscience formation in this article. Conscience formation is important because it helps us to understand what is truly good. And it helps us to teach synderesis, which is such a basic primal principle. It's like what you saw in the Baby Lab. Conscience helps to make it ordered to the truly good. The next question, what role does scripture and tradition play? Well, like I said earlier, Jesus wanted us to know his values. And he gave us the church, which gave us both the Bible and the oral tradition through the magisterium, so we could know God's values. Because again, because of the fall, before the fall, we would have been naturally in union with God. We call that original holiness. We wouldn't need the Bible. We wouldn't need the church. But because of the fall from grace, we need the guidance of Jesus that Jesus gives us through his church to help inform us about what's right and wrong. Because concupiscence will make it difficult for us to see the true good. And finally, number 5, let me see here if I could get it. It's down. Let me move that. So it's down here. So number 5, the article describes the judgment of conscience as a dialogue. Explain what the author means by creating a sample dialogue in a person who's trying to make a judgment of conscience. So different students did this in different ways. Some just wrote a dialogue. Some drew little pictures. But the idea is you have reason. And you have your reason, and you have your conscience, and you have your will. And so conscience engages reason. So you have baser desire. You have like your appetites. So maybe you have a desire. I keep using the example of food just because it's something that we all struggle with, maybe wanting to eat too many cookies, and it's something that's not, I don't think it's a super controversial moral issue. So I may desire the cookies, and to me, the cookies, synderesis says the cookie is good, but reason tells me that cookies have a lot of sugar and a lot of calories. And so I say to I can engage reason and make a judgment. I can say, yes, I desire the cookies. They are good, but they're high in calories, they're high in fat, and they're high in sugar. So then my conscience makes a judgment call, and it says, maybe my conscience says cookies are good because they'll bring me pleasure, but they're bad because they may make me get diabetes if I eat too many. So the judgment of my conscience is I will eat one cookie. Now that's where the will comes into play. My will is my ability to act and choose and control my actions. So if I'm a person of virtue, remember from Aristotle, and I don't have the vice of gluttony, I'll eat the one cookie and I will be happy and I won't struggle. Now, of course, if I've fallen into the vice of gluttony, I might eat the one cookie and then maybe eat 5 more. It kind of depends on what my character how my character has been formed at that point. But that's just a little sort of illustration of how these principles all work in practice. Now the next slide was just a check for understanding I did with the class at the end of the period. So if you're absent, you'll be excused from that. But this is our lesson on conscience, what it is and how it works. If you have any questions, please see me. And if you were absent, this assignment we just went over is called Homework 2. And you need to make sure to make it up because the book doesn't do a sufficient job, in my opinion, of explaining how the conscience actually works, but this article does. So please make sure you make that up if you're absent. If you need any help, let me know.